I was hanging laundry on the line when I saw the buggy coming up the lane. Two figures sat in it, and something about the way they sat close together, shoulders touching, made my hands stop moving. A pillowcase flapped against my cheek in the wind, and I let it. I just stood there, clothespins digging into my palm, watching. The horse was a standard bay mare, nothing remarkable, but the buggy itself caught my attention. It was Samuel's buggy. I'd know those brass lanterns anywhere. I'd polished them myself every Saturday for 3 years, standing in the barn while Samuel worked on his wood carving and pretended not to watch me. The buggy stopped at the end of the lane, and for a moment, nobody moved. I could see Samuel's silhouette, his familiar broad shoulders, and that slight tilt of his head I'd memorized long ago. Beside him sat a woman I didn't recognize. She was wearing a blue dress and a white prayer covering, and she had her hand resting on Samuel's arm like it belonged there. Like it had always belonged there. I remember thinking very clearly that I should feel something dramatic. My heart should pound, my knees should buckle, the world should tilt, but instead I just felt cold. The kind of cold that starts somewhere deep in your bones and spreads outward, slow and certain, like ice forming on a pond in November. Samuel climbed down from the buggy first. He moved the way he always moved, deliberate, careful, like every step mattered. He turned and offered his hand to the woman, and she took it, stepping down with the kind of grace that comes from practice, from familiarity. They walked toward me together, and I still didn't move. The pillowcase kept flapping. The wind kept blowing. The sun kept shining, which seemed wrong somehow. The world should have the decency to at least cloud over. "Rebecca," Samuel said when they were close enough. His voice was the same. That was the thing that got me. His voice was exactly the same. I looked at him. I looked at the woman beside him. She was younger than me, maybe by 5 years, with pale blonde hair pulled back severely and eyes the color of a winter sky. She was looking at me with something I couldn't quite read. Not hostility. Not exactly. More like wariness mixed with a strange kind of hope. "Rebecca," Samuel said again, and this time his voice cracked a little. "I need to tell you something." I waited. "This is Miriam," he said. "She's my wife." The clothespins fell out of my hand. They made a small clattering sound against the frozen ground, and I watched them scatter without really seeing them. My mind caught on the word and wouldn't let go. "Wife, wife, wife, I'm your wife," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Flat, empty, like a room where all the furniture had been moved out. Samuel's face crumpled. I'd never seen him cry before, not once in 3 years of marriage, but there were tears sliding down his cheeks now. He didn't wipe them away. "I know," he said. "I know you are, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Rebecca. I never meant for any of this to happen." Miriam stepped forward then. She was still holding Samuel's hand, I noticed, still holding it like she had every right to. "May we come inside?" she asked. Her voice was soft with an accent I couldn't quite place. "It's cold out here and I think we have a lot to explain." I looked at her. I looked at my husband. I looked at their joined hands. "I don't understand," I said. "I know," Miriam said. "But you will, I promise you will." "My name is Rebecca Lapp, and I'm 27 years old. I grew up in this house, actually, the same farmhouse where I was hanging laundry that morning. My parents built it when they first married, and when they moved to a smaller place in town 3 years ago, Samuel and I took it over. I know every creaking floorboard, every stubborn window, every spot on the kitchen ceiling where the roof used to leak before Samuel fixed it. Samuel fixed so many things in this house. He fixed the roof and the porch steps and the fence along the north pasture. He built the chicken coop with his own hands, planing the wood until it was smooth as silk. He was good with his hands, my husband. Patient. Careful. The kind of man who would measure 3 times before cutting once because he couldn't stand the thought of wasting good lumber. That's the man I thought I married. The patient, careful man who wouldn't waste anything. I was 24 when we wed, which is old for an Amish woman. Most of my friends married at 19 or 20, but I'd been caring for my mother after her stroke, and marriage had to wait. Samuel didn't seem to mind. He'd been patient with me from the beginning, from our first buggy ride together when I was 17 and too shy to say more than 3 words. He just smiled and filled the silence with stories about his woodworking, about the farm he wanted to own someday, about the children he hoped to raise. We courted for 7 years before we finally married. 7 years, Everyone in the community thought we were sweethearts destined to be together. My mother called it God's timing. My father said Samuel was the most dependable young man he'd ever met. Dependable. That was the word everyone used for Samuel. Dependable, reliable, steady. The kind of man who would never surprise you, never shock you, never do anything unexpected. I led them into the kitchen because I didn't know what else to do. It's what my mother would have done. No matter what news someone brought to your door, you invited them inside. You offered them coffee. You maintained your dignity. Amish hospitality doesn't have exceptions for heartbreak. Miriam sat down at my kitchen table like she'd been sitting there her whole life. She folded her hands in front of her and looked around the room with open curiosity. The blue curtains I'd sewn last winter, the row of canning jars on the windowsill, the wooden bread box Samuel had carved for me as a wedding gift. Her eyes lingered on the bread box. "He made that, didn't he?" she asked. I nodded. I couldn't speak. I was standing by the stove, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to remember how to breathe. "He made one for me too," she said. "A jewelry box. It has little roses carved into the lid. He said they reminded him of me." I didn't have roses on my bread box. I had wheat stalks. He'd told me wheat was practical, that it represented sustenance and provision. I'd thought it was romantic. Now I wondered if he'd just run out of ideas. Samuel was still standing near the door, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to come all the way in. His hat was in his hands, and he was turning it around and around, the way he always did when he was nervous. I'd seen him do that 100 times, before asking my father for permission to court me, before proposing, before telling me that the harvest had been poor and we'd have to tighten our belts for the winter. "Sit down, Samuel," I said. "You're making me nervous just standing there." He sat. Old habits, I guess. He'd always done what I asked. I made coffee because I needed something to do with my hands. I ground the beans and filled the percolator and set it on the stove, moving through the familiar motions like a puppet being worked by strings. Miriam watched me the whole time. Samuel stared at the table. When the coffee was ready, I poured 3 cups and set them on the table. I didn't have any cake or cookies to offer. I'd been planning to bake that afternoon, but neither of them seemed to expect anything. We sat in silence for a long moment, the steam rising from our cups, the clock on the wall ticking out the seconds. "Tell me," I finally said. "Tell me everything." Samuel met Miriam 6 years ago, 2 years before we married. He'd gone to Ohio for a lumber auction. There was a sawmill closing down near Millersburg, and he'd heard they were selling off their inventory at good prices. He stayed with a cousin who lived in the area, and on his second day there, he stopped at a roadside produce stand to buy some apples. Miriam was working the stand. Her family had moved to Ohio from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where they'd lived for generations. Her father was a furniture maker, and Miriam helped him sell his pieces at markets and fairs throughout the region. She was 19 years old, with pale blonde hair and winter sky eyes, and a laugh that made Samuel forget, just for a moment, that he was supposed to be courting someone back home. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Samuel said, still staring at the table. "I swear to you, Rebecca, I didn't mean for any of it to happen. But it happened anyway." He stayed in Ohio for 2 weeks instead of 1. He went back to Miriam's produce stand every single day. He met her parents and shook her father's hand and ate dinner at their table. He told them he was a woodworker from Indiana who was looking to settle down, and he didn't mention my name. Not once. "I was going to tell her," he said. "Every night I told myself that tomorrow I would tell her. But then tomorrow would come and I'd see her face, and I just couldn't." He came home after 2 weeks and didn't say a word to me. He took me on buggy rides and held my hand and talked about our future, and the whole time he was writing letters to Miriam in Ohio. Secret letters, sent to a post office box in Millersburg so her parents wouldn't find them. "I thought I could stop," he said. "I thought if I just married you, everything would become real. I thought I'd forget about her." We married in November, a beautiful ceremony with the whole community in attendance. My mother cried. My father beamed. Samuel said his vows in a clear, steady voice, and I believed every word. For 3 years, I believed every word. But he never stopped writing to Miriam. He'd find excuses to go to town and mail the letters from the post office there. He'd receive her replies at the same post office box, which he'd opened under a false name. He built an entire second life out of paper and ink and lies, and I never suspected a thing. We got married 6 months ago, Miriam said quietly. In Ohio, in my parents' church. I felt the words hit me like a physical blow. 6 months. My husband had married another woman 6 months ago, and I'd had no idea. I'd been cooking his meals and washing his clothes and sharing his bed, and the whole time he had another wife waiting for him in Ohio. How? I asked. My voice came out as a whisper. How is that even possible? He'd used a different name, a variation of his middle name and his mother's maiden name. He'd told Miriam's community that he was a widower from Pennsylvania looking for a fresh start. He'd fabricated an entire history, complete with a dead wife and a childhood tragedy and a testimony of faith that had brought their bishop to tears. You're not Amish, I said to Miriam. The accusation came out harsher than I'd intended, but I couldn't help it. You can't be Amish and not know that what he did was wrong. I am Amish, Miriam said, and there was steel in her voice now. I'm Amish, and I love my husband, and I didn't know about you until 3 weeks ago. When I found out, I insisted we come here immediately. I told him he had to make things right. Make things right, I repeated. The words tasted bitter in my mouth. How exactly do you propose to make things right? The afternoon wore on. The coffee grew cold in our cups. Samuel talked and talked, spilling out 3 years of deception like poison from a wound. He'd been traveling back and forth between Indiana and Ohio the whole time. He'd tell me he was going to lumber auctions or visiting distant relatives or helping friends with barn raisings. Sometimes he'd be gone for a week, sometimes 2. I never questioned it. Amish men travel for work all the time. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't suspicious. It was just life. But he was spending those weeks with Miriam. He was building a life with her, piece by piece, just like he'd built one with me. He'd help her father in the furniture shop. He'd sit beside her in church. He'd eat dinner at her table and pray with her family and sleep in the room they'd prepared for him. I told her I was looking for land in Ohio, he said. I told her I wanted to build her a house. I told her, his voice broke. I told her so many things. What did you tell me? I asked. During those 3 years, what did you tell me? He couldn't answer, or wouldn't. Miriam reached across the table and put her hand over his. The gesture was so natural, so intimate, that I felt my stomach turn. This woman had been my husband's wife for 6 months. She'd stood before her church and promised to love him until death. She'd given him her body and her heart and her future, and she'd done it without knowing I existed. In the eyes of her community, she was his rightful wife. In the eyes of mine, I was. Both marriages had been performed by ordained ministers. Both had been witnessed by congregations. Both were real and both were impossible. What happens now? I asked. Miriam looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at the table. I don't know, he said. The bishops will have to decide. Both of us can't be married to you. One of these marriages has to be invalid. Which one? Miriam asked. Her voice was steady, but I could see her hands trembling. I don't know, Samuel said again. I stood up from the table. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I need to think, I said. I need to be alone for a while. Neither of them tried to stop me. I walked out the back door and into the yard, past the laundry still flapping on the line, past the chicken coop Samuel had built, past the garden where I'd been planning to plant tomatoes in the spring. I walked until I reached the edge of the pasture, where the fence Samuel had repaired last summer stretched out in a neat line toward the woods. I put my hands on the top rail and leaned forward, letting my weight rest against the wood. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed. The world kept going on, indifferent to the fact that my life had just shattered into pieces. I thought about the last 3 years. The mornings I'd woken up beside Samuel, watching his chest rise and fall in sleep. The evenings we'd spent reading the Bible together by the fire. The way he'd looked at me on our wedding day, his eyes shining with what I'd believed was love. Had any of it been real? Had he ever loved me at all? Or was I just the convenient choice, the girl back home, the one he'd settled for because he couldn't figure out how to be with the woman he really wanted? The worst part was that I couldn't tell. Looking back through every memory, every conversation, every moment of tenderness, I couldn't tell what had been genuine and what had been performance. The line between love and deception had dissolved completely, and I was left with nothing but questions. A sound behind me made me turn. Miriam was walking across the pasture toward me, her blue dress catching the last light of the sun. She stopped a few feet away, keeping a careful distance. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know you wanted to be alone, but I needed to talk to you without Samuel." I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. I hadn't even realized I was crying. "What do you want to talk about?" "I wanted to tell you that I'm not your enemy." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You married my husband." "I married a man I believed was free to marry me," she said. "When I found out the truth, I made him come here. I made him face what he'd done. I could have stayed in Ohio and pretended I never knew, but I didn't. I came here because I believe you deserve the truth." I studied her face in the fading light. She was younger than me, yes, but there was something old in her eyes, something that had seen pain before and learned to carry it. "Why did he do it?" I asked. "Did he ever tell you why?" Miriam was quiet for a moment. "He said he loved us both." "That's not an answer." "I know." She stepped closer, her shoes pressing into the soft earth. "He said he met me and felt something he'd never felt before, something that scared him. He thought if he ignored it, it would go away, but it didn't, and by the time he realized he couldn't ignore it, he was already married to you." "So he should have told me then," I said. "3 years ago, when he first realized he wanted to be with you, he should have told me and ended our marriage before it really began." "Yes," Miriam said simply. "He should have." Honesty in her voice caught me off guard. I'd expected her to defend him, to make excuses, to argue that their love was special and therefore justified. But she didn't. She just stood there in the cold evening air, admitting that her husband, our husband, had done something unforgivable. "Do you love him?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "Do you?" I thought about the bread box with the wheat stalks, the roof he'd fixed, the way he'd held my hand during my mother's illness, never flinching, never pulling away. I thought about the 7 years of courtship, the buggy rides and the whispered conversations and the future we'd planned together. "I don't know anymore," I said, and that was the truth. The next few days were a blur of whispered conversations and sleepless nights. Miriam and Samuel stayed at my parents' old house in town. My mother and father had moved to a smaller place after Deed's arthritis got bad, and the old house was sitting empty while my brother decided what to do with it. I told them they couldn't stay with me, and to Miriam's credit, she didn't argue. The news spread through the community faster than a barn fire. Amish communities don't have telephones or internet, but they have something just as effective: the Sunday meeting, the quilting circle, the casual conversations at the general store. Within 48 hours, everyone knew that Samuel Lapp had 2 wives. Everyone knew that I was one of them. People didn't know what to do with the information. Some came by with food, the way they would for a funeral, which made a certain terrible sense. Others avoided me entirely, crossing to the other side of the street when they saw me coming. I couldn't blame them. What do you say to a woman whose husband has married someone else? There's no script for that, no casserole recipe that covers it. My mother came over on the third day. She walked in without knocking, the way she always did, and found me sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing. "Well," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "I've been praying about this." My mother has always been a practical woman. She'd survived my father's drinking when I was young, before he found his faith and gave it up. She'd survived a stroke that left her right side weak and her speech permanently slurred. She'd survived the death of 2 babies before I was born, tiny graves in the church cemetery that we still put flowers on every spring. She knew about survival. "What did God tell you?" I asked. "He told me my daughter was hurting," she said. "So I came." I started crying then, the kind of crying I'd been holding back for days. My mother came around the table and put her arms around me, and I buried my face in her shoulder like I was a child again. She didn't say anything. She just held me, rocking slightly back and forth, while the tears soaked through the fabric of her dress. "I don't know what to do, ma'am," I said when I could speak again. "I don't know how to fix this." "Some things can't be fixed," she said. "Some things you just have to live through." "But what am I supposed to live through, being his wife, not being his wife, watching him go back to Ohio with her?" My mother was quiet for a moment. "Has he told you what he wants?" "He says he loves us both. He says he can't choose." That's cowardice, my mother said flatly. Not love. I pulled back and looked at her. What do you mean? Love is supposed to make you brave, Rebecca. It's supposed to make you willing to sacrifice. If he truly loved either of you, he would be willing to sacrifice his own happiness to do what's right. Instead, he's asking both of you to sacrifice for him. I'd never thought about it that way. Samuel had been so tearful, so remorseful, so obviously tormented by the situation he'd created. I'd felt sorry for him in some strange way, but my mother was right. He wasn't being brave, he wasn't being selfless. He was standing in the middle of the wreckage he'd caused and asking us to feel sorry for how hard it was for him. What should I do? I asked. That's between you and God, she said. But whatever you decide, don't decide it out of fear. Decide it out of strength. The bishops held a meeting on the 5th day. 3 of them came from neighboring districts, along with our own bishop, a gentle old man named Eli Yoder who had baptized me when I was 16 and married me when I was 24. They gathered in the schoolhouse after the children had gone home for the day, and they called Samuel, Miriam, and me to come and give our testimonies. I dressed carefully that morning, putting on my best black dress and a fresh white covering. I pinned my hair up tight, the way my mother had taught me, and I looked at myself in the small mirror above my dresser. The woman looking back at me seemed older than she'd been a week ago. There were shadows under her eyes and new lines around her mouth, but her gaze was steady. She wasn't going to break. Samuel spoke first at the meeting. He told the whole story from the beginning, meeting Miriam at the produce stand, the letters, the secret trips, the second wedding in Ohio. His voice was hoarse, and several times he had to stop and collect himself. Miriam sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, her face pale but composed. Then it was my turn. I stood up and faced the bishops, 4 old men with long beards and kind eyes who had known me my entire life. I told them about the 3 years of my marriage, the way I'd trusted Samuel completely, the way I'd never suspected a thing. I told them about the laundry on the line, and the buggy coming up the lane, and the moment my world collapsed. What do you want? Bishop Yoder asked me when I was finished. His voice was gentle, the same voice that had guided me through my teenage struggles and my mother's illness and my wedding vows. If you could choose the outcome of this meeting, what would it be? I'd been asking myself the same question for days. Did I want Samuel back? Could I ever trust him again? Did I even want to try? The thought of sharing my bed with him now made my skin crawl, but the thought of being alone, of starting over at 27 with a failed marriage behind me, was terrifying in its own way. I want to know the truth, I said. I want to know which marriage is real in God's eyes, and I want Samuel to stop lying, to everyone, forever. The bishops conferred for a long time. They quoted scripture and consulted the ordnung and prayed together in the corner of the schoolhouse while we sat in silence. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, catching dust motes in the air. Miriam stared straight ahead. Samuel kept his eyes on the floor. Finally, Bishop Yoder stood and faced us. His expression was grave. This is a difficult situation, he said, one that the ordnung does not directly address. Samuel has entered into 2 marriage covenants, both witnessed by the church, both solemnized before God. Both of you entered into these marriages in good faith, believing that Samuel was free to marry. And I saw his shoulders sag under some invisible weight. The Bible teaches that marriage is a covenant between one man and one woman, and that this covenant is binding until death. However, it is clear that Samuel made his second covenant under false pretenses. He deceived Miriam's family, her church, and Miriam herself. He also deceived his first wife, Rebecca, by continuing the relationship in secret. Miriam spoke up for the first time. Are you saying my marriage is invalid? Bishop Yoder looked at her with compassion. I'm saying that your marriage was built on a foundation of lies. Samuel presented himself as a widower. He gave a false name. He told a false history. A covenant entered into under false pretenses is not a true covenant. Miriam's face went very still. So my marriage doesn't count. In the eyes of the church, yes, your marriage to Samuel is not valid. I should have felt relief. I should have felt vindicated. But instead, I just felt hollow, because invalidating Miriam's marriage didn't fix mine. It didn't erase the letters or the lies or the 3 years of deception. It didn't give me back the husband I'd thought I had. What about my marriage? I asked. Is that valid? Bishop Yoder looked at me for a long moment. Your marriage was entered into honestly, at least on your part. Samuel made his vows before God and the church while concealing an ongoing relationship with another woman. That is a form of adultery. So my marriage is valid. Your marriage is valid, but that doesn't mean you have to stay in it. I felt something shift inside me at those words, permission. He was giving me permission. In a community where divorce was virtually unheard of, where marriage vows were considered unbreakable, Bishop Yoder was telling me that I had a choice. Samuel's actions constitute a violation of his marriage covenant, the bishop continued. The church does not require a wife to remain with a husband who has committed adultery, especially adultery of this nature. If Rebecca chooses to end the marriage, she will have the full support of the church. Samuel made a sound then, a choked sob that he tried to stifle with his hand. I didn't look at him, I kept my eyes on Bishop Yoder. And if she chooses to stay? Miriam asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. Then Samuel must confess his sins before the congregation and accept whatever discipline the church deems appropriate. He must sever all contact with you, Miriam, and commit himself fully to his first wife. That is the only path to reconciliation. I didn't make my decision right away. Bishop Yoder advised me to take my time, to pray, to listen for God's voice. So I did. I spent hours in my room with the door closed, reading my Bible and waiting for clarity that didn't come. I walked the fields until my legs ached, letting the winter wind sting my face. I talked to my mother and my father and my closest friend, a woman named Hannah who had been married for 10 years and had 4 children. What would you do? I asked Hannah as we sat in her kitchen, watching her youngest play with wooden blocks on the floor. Hannah was quiet for a long time. I don't know, she finally said. I love my husband, I can't imagine my life without him. But if he did what Samuel did, if he lied to me for years, if he married someone else, I don't know if I could ever trust him again. That's the thing, I said. The trust. It's gone. Every memory I have of our marriage is tainted now. I look back on our wedding day, and I wonder if he was thinking about her. I remember him bringing me flowers after my mother's stroke, and I wonder if he'd just come back from Ohio. That's a terrible way to live. Yes. I thought about what my mother had said, about love making you brave. Samuel hadn't been brave. He'd been afraid of hurting me, afraid of losing Miriam, afraid of the consequences of his own choices. And that fear had led him to do something far worse than the truth ever could have been. If he'd told me 3 years ago, before we married, that he'd met someone else, I would have been devastated. But I would have survived. I would have moved on. Instead, he'd chosen to marry me while loving someone else. And then he'd married her while still being married to me, and now 3 lives were in ruins because he couldn't face the truth. I went to see Samuel on the 7th day. He was staying at my parents' old house, the one he'd supposedly been fixing up for my brother. I found him sitting on the front porch, a piece of wood in his hands that he was carving with small, precise movements. What are you making? I asked, settling onto the porch swing a few feet away. He held up the wood. It was a bird, a small finch with delicate wings. I don't know why I'm making it. I just needed to do something with my hands. We sat in silence for a while. The afternoon was cold but clear, the kind of winter day where the sky looks like blue glass. A few crows argued in the bare branches of the oak tree by the road. Everything was very still. Need to ask you something, I said. And I need you to tell me the truth, the real truth, not the truth you think I want to hear. Samuel set down the carving. I'll try. Why did you marry me? After you'd already met her, after you knew you loved her, why did you still marry me? He was quiet for a long time. So long I thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he spoke, and his voice was so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him. I was afraid of what everyone would think, he said. Everyone expected us to marry. Your parents, my parents, the whole community. We'd been courting for years. People called us sweethearts. If I'd broken things off to be with someone I met at a produce stand in Ohio, everyone would have thought I was crazy. They would have judged me. They would have judged her. Partly, he said, and partly because I did love you. I do love you. That's the part I can't explain. I loved you and I loved her and I couldn't figure out how to stop loving either of you. Love isn't supposed to work like that, I said. I know. Love is supposed to be a choice. You're supposed to choose one person and then keep choosing them every day no matter what. I know. But you didn't choose, I said. You tried to have both of us, and you lied to make it possible, and now everyone is hurt. He didn't answer. He just sat there with the half-carved finch in his hands, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The dependable, reliable, steady man who had never done anything unexpected. Except he had. He'd done the most unexpected thing imaginable, and he'd done it for years. I've made my decision, I said. Samuel looked up. His eyes were red and there were tear tracks on his cheeks. What is it? I'm ending our marriage. The words hung in the cold air between us. I'd expected to feel relief after saying them, or grief, or anger. Instead, I just felt tired. The deep, bone-weary tiredness of someone who has been carrying a heavy weight for a very long time and has finally set it down. I understand, Samuel said. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just nodded slowly, like someone waking up from a long dream. I don't hate you, I said. I thought I would. I thought I'd feel nothing but anger for the rest of my life. But I don't hate you, Samuel. I just can't be married to you anymore. What will you do? I don't know yet. Stay here maybe. The house is mine, my parents gave it to us and I'm the one staying. You'll need to find somewhere else to live. He nodded again. That's fair. I'm not going to try to keep you from Miriam, I said. If you love her and she still wants you after all of this, then be with her. But don't lie to her anymore. Don't lie to anyone. I won't. I stood up from the porch swing. My legs felt steady. My heart felt, if not whole, at least not shattered. The pieces were still there. They just needed time to fit back together. Goodbye, Samuel, I said. Goodbye, Rebecca. I walked back down the lane toward my house. Toward my house. Not ours, mine. The chicken coop he'd built, the roof he'd fixed, the fence he'd repaired, they were mine now. I would take care of them. I would fill them with new memories, memories that didn't have shadows lurking at the edges. Miriam came to see me the next morning. She was leaving that afternoon to go back to Ohio, and she wanted to say goodbye. I'm sorry, she said, standing in my kitchen doorway. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her prayer covering slightly askew. I know that word doesn't fix anything, but I am sorry. I believe you, I said, and I did. Miriam hadn't chosen this any more than I had. She'd been lied to as much as I'd been lied to, maybe more. She'd married a man who didn't exist, a widower from Pennsylvania with a tragic past and a testimony of faith. The real Samuel, the weak, frightened, deceitful Samuel, was someone she was only now getting to know. You going to stay with him? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know, I love him, I can't just turn that off, but I don't trust him and I don't know if I ever will. That's where I ended up too. She smiled then, a sad, tired smile. We have more in common than I thought. I poured us both cups of coffee and we sat at the kitchen table together, the same table where Samuel had broken my world apart just over a week ago. It felt different now. Lighter somehow. Like a room where the windows had finally been opened, after being shut for too long. I ask you something, Miriam said. Of course. Do you think you'll ever forgive him? I thought about it. Forgiveness was a cornerstone of our faith. We were taught to forgive as God forgave us freely, completely, without reservation. But forgiveness wasn't the same as trust. You could forgive someone and still not want them in your life. You could release your anger without releasing your boundaries. I think I already have, I said. Not completely. It'll take time, but I'm not angry anymore. I'm just sad, and I think that's part of forgiveness too. Miriam nodded slowly. I hope I can get there someday. You will, it just takes time. She finished her coffee and stood up. At the door, she paused and turned back. If I do stay with him, if we end up together, I hope that doesn't hurt you. I hope you know it's not because I don't care about what happened to you. I know, I said, and I hope you know that whatever happens, I don't blame you for any of this. She nodded, her eyes glistening, and then she was gone. I watched her buggy disappear down the lane, the same lane where I'd first seen her sitting beside my husband with her hand on his arm. It felt like a lifetime ago. In a way, it was. The woman who had stood at the clothesline, watching them approach, was someone I barely recognized anymore. Spring came early that year. The snow melted in February, and by March, the ground was soft enough to till. I planted my garden, tomatoes and peppers and green beans, the same as always, and I fixed the fence along the north pasture myself. It took me 3 days and my hands were covered in blisters by the end, but I did it. I stood back and looked at that fence and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Pride. Accomplishment. The knowledge that I was capable of more than I'd ever given myself credit for. The community was kind to me. There were some awkward moments, of course. Sunday services where people didn't quite know what to say, quilting circles where conversations stopped when I walked in the room. But mostly, people were good. They brought me food when I was sick. They invited me to their homes for dinner. They treated me like a person, not a scandal. My mother came over every Tuesday afternoon, and we'd drink coffee and work on our quilting and talk about everything except Samuel. Eventually, we started talking about him, too. Slowly in pieces, the way you'd pick at a scab you knew needed to heal. "Do you think you'll ever marry again?" she asked me one afternoon in April. The windows were open, and the smell of fresh-cut grass drifted in from outside. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe, if I meet someone who's worthy of my trust." "That's a good answer. What about Samuel?" I asked. "Have you heard anything?" My mother's needle paused in the fabric. "He's in Ohio now, with Miriam. They're trying to make it work." Nodded. I'd heard the same from various sources. Samuel had moved to Millersburg permanently, had confessed his sins before Miriam's congregation, and was undergoing a period of discipline and counseling. Miriam had decided to stay with him, though I gathered it wasn't an easy decision. Some wounds took a long time to heal. "I hope they make it," I said. My mother looked at me with surprise. "Do you mean that?" "I do, not for his sake, well, maybe a little for his sake, but mostly for hers. She didn't deserve any of this. If she can find happiness with him, then I'm glad." My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and squeezed my hand. "Your father and I are proud of you, you know, the way you've handled all of this, the grace you've shown. It doesn't always feel graceful from the inside. That's how you know it's real." Summer came, hot and humid, the way Indiana summers always are. I spent my days working in the garden and tending to the chickens and helping my neighbors with their harvests. I went to singings and youth gatherings, not because I was looking for a husband, but because I was tired of being alone. I made new friends, people I'd never really talked to before because I'd been so wrapped up in my life with Samuel. I learned things about myself that year. I learned that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. I learned that I could be alone without being lonely. I learned that my identity wasn't tied to being someone's wife, that I was a whole person all on my own, with my own thoughts and dreams and value. One evening in August, I was sitting on my porch watching the sun go down when a buggy came up the lane. My heart lurched for a moment, old habits, old fears, but then I saw who it was. My brother and his wife, bringing their new baby for a visit. I held my nephew in my arms and marveled at the weight of him, the warmth, the tiny fingers that wrapped around my thumb. My sister-in-law chatted about the difficulties of nursing, and my brother complained about the price of feed, and it was all so ordinary, so normal that I wanted to cry from the sheer relief of it. Life went on. That was the miracle. No matter what happened, no matter how shattered things became, life kept going. The sun kept rising. The crops kept growing. The chickens kept laying eggs. And people kept loving each other, fumbling toward connection, making mistakes and trying to fix them. I wasn't the same woman who had stood at the clothesline, watching her world fall apart. I was someone new, someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Not unscathed, I would carry scars from this for the rest of my life, but still standing, still breathing, still capable of joy. I looked down at my nephew's sleeping face and I smiled. It was a real smile. One that came from somewhere deep inside, somewhere that had been dark for a long time and was finally letting in the light. The sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The first stars appeared, faint pinpricks of light against the deepening blue. I sat on the porch with my family around me, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again. Peace. Not the peace of having all my questions answered. Not the peace of a tidy resolution. But the peace of knowing that I had survived the worst thing that had ever happened to me, and that I was still here. Still me, still whole. The world was wide and uncertain and full of pain, but it was also full of beauty. Full of babies and sunsets and the sound of crickets on a summer evening. Full of second chances and new beginnings and the quiet courage of ordinary people doing their best. I didn't know what the future held. Maybe I would marry again someday. Maybe I wouldn't. Maybe I would travel or start a business or take up a new hobby. The possibilities stretched out before me like a road disappearing into the distance, unknown but inviting. Whatever came next, I was ready for it. I was ready because I knew now what I was made of. I knew that I could face the worst and still find my way back to the light. I knew that forgiveness was possible, even when trust was not. I knew that love wasn't always enough, but grace was. And I knew, with a certainty that went all the way down to my bones, that I was going to be all right. The baby stirred in my arms, making a small sound of contentment. I held him closer, feeling the steady rhythm of his breath, the miracle of his tiny heartbeat. Life was strange. Life was hard. Life was beautiful. And it was mine.